The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
Welcome back. Now, we talked about this before the break. The US Treasury Department is out with a 40-page report warning that DeFi services that aren't compliant with anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules pose the most significant current illicit finance risk. Joining us now to discuss this and more is TRM Labs Head of Legal and Government Affairs, Redbord, but perhaps most importantly, he is also the new vice chair of the new CFTC Technology Advisory Committee. Welcome, Harry.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Always great to join the show.
All right, diving straight in. Previously, you were the senior advisor to the Deputy Secretary and the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Treasury. So just let's get your zoomed out reaction to this particular report.
So it's definitely a risk assessment, obviously, and it focuses on what are the risks, from the DeFi ecosystem, but also to the DeFi ecosystem. So you hear sort of about ransomware and hacks and scams and various sort of fraud and money laundering. But what's really sort of the big takeaway of this report is also what it says about regulation. And really, for the first time, and to be clear, this is the most comprehensive discussion that we've seen out of the US government on DeFi to date. It says, look, if you are providing financial services, whether centralized or decentralized, then you have compliance obligations, anti-money laundering obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act, which is really the US regime for anti-money laundering that typically applies to financial institutions. Here, Treasury is saying it should also apply to the decentralized finance space.
All right, but one of the questions that has emerged is, and I was talking to Lawrence about that while you were off. The report has said that thieves, scammers, ransomware, cyber criminals, and bad actors, basically from North Korea, are using DeFi to launder proceeds from crime. And the perception from industry is that why are we being clubbed? Why is DeFi being clubbed with a word or a phrase or a country like North Korea? Is that disproportionate to DeFi's true value? That's the question.
Absolutely. And I think, look, it's, as I said, sort of this was Treasury set out to do a risk assessment, and that's really what it did. So the focus is on risk. But the reality is Treasury acknowledges as well that these risks in the DeFi ecosystem are very, very small, even compared to sort of the overall cryptocurrency ecosystem, and infinitesimal compared to sort of traditional finance. So we're talking about a very, very small subset here of financial crime. There's no question. The other thing that Treasury acknowledges is, look, most of the money laundering and financial crime today occurs in sort of the more traditional centralized cryptocurrency space, because bad actors like North Korea still need off-ramps to exit those funds to sort of more usable traditional currencies. And that's where the real risks exist today. So what you're saying is, look, North Korea can launder or attempt to launder hacked funds through the DeFi ecosystem, whether it's through mixers or whether it's through DEXs or other sorts of means. However, they still need to find those on and off ramps. And those are at centralized exchanges that have AML controls today, anti-money laundering controls today, and are required to, just like a financial institution. So to your question, obviously the promise of this technology is truly extraordinary. And what we're talking about is a very, very small amount of risk comparatively.
Nonetheless, the department also said that, hey, look, there are things there and enhancements that is what they're calling it, that could happen in DeFi that would help with AML, anti-money laundering, and counterterrorism. What exactly would those enhancements be? How would it really work? And how hard would it be to implement?
Yeah, and one thing that's really important to sort of note, Treasury specifically says that they are not establishing any new supervisory expectations with this risk assessment. It's not guidance, it's certainly not regulation, but it really is the first, I think, sort of view that we have into the way the US Treasury Department is thinking about regulation. And what they say here is, look, we don't care if you're centralized or decentralized. What we care about is the activity. And if the activity is financial services, then you should have anti-money laundering controls under the Bank Secrecy Act. In other words, today you are essentially required to have those controls. But the reality is, true DeFi is, disintermediated, software, right? That doesn't have teams of compliance officers the way traditional financial institutions. And I think that's the paradox that we have here. And I think, over the next, I think one thing that's really important is Treasury talks over and over again about wanting to engage with industry, wanting to create guidance out of those conversations. So I think what we'll see over the next, year or so are those conversations taking place, industry engaging, and really having Treasury understand what is possible around sort of anti-money laundering when it comes to the space.
So speaking of looking ahead, I mean, this report here was a continuation of President Biden's EO, the executive order that came out last year. You're at TRM Labs. You guys are on top of everything, and blockchain intelligence. You're keeping tabs on everything. 5 years from now, those conversations that you just discussed, they happen or they don't happen. Either way, what do you see the future looking like for DeFi?
Now, it's a great question. And, look, I think the ecosystem, we're going to see a robust ecosystem. This idea of, peer-to-peer value transfer on blockchains without intermediaries, sort of the promise of, on-chain financial services. But I think we're also going to see, controls in place to ensure that exosystem is secure, right? We can't have a system in which North Korea can steal sort of billions of dollars from bridges and DEXs and DeFi protocols. So I think we're going to see a balancing. And one thing that Treasury does highlight is the need to work with industry on building tools. So it talks a lot about, hey, look, digital identity and zero knowledge proof and blockchain intelligence. So really, I think Treasury is looking to work with industry, specifically industry that's building tools for anti-money laundering to sort of allow safety in the ecosystem, but also to ensure privacy and the continued growth of the DeFi ecosystem.
All right. The past few questions we asked you were in the capacity as TRM Labs Head of Legal and Government Affairs. Now, I want to ask you a question as the new Vice Chair of the new CFTC Technology Advisory Committee, if you permit so, of course. We know that the SEC thinks of Ether as a security and that CFTC thinks of it as a commodity. What are traders and businesses in this space supposed to do in that situation? Should they be what should they really be doing? How do they handle it? How do they work through that? And what's your personal view on that, either in the official capacity or as a representative of an industry company?
Sure, absolutely. Look, I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the U.S. sort of regulatory space today is that companies, businesses are having to sort of skate to where they think the puck is headed, with very little sort of legal frameworks in order to do that. And I think that's really the challenge. And I think, look, over the next, however long it is, 6 months, a year, 18 months or more, we're going to see ultimately sort of play out sort of what regulator is actually going to be supervising, what space, what assets are securities, what are commodities. But I think right now, sort of the best we can do is attempt to try to best understand sort of what regulatory compliance looks like. And there's no question it's a challenge for businesses, but I also think sort of we're going to continue to see sort of more guidance, at least from regulators.
So you're continuing to walk the tightrope just the same way that you walk the tightrope on this question, which I appreciate because I guess this is a difficult question to answer.
It's a hard question with no answers today.
But what do you see? What do you see those that guidance being? I mean, ultimately, what do you think? How do you think that guidance will look like?
I think that space is going to be regulated by a number of different, financial regulators in the United States.
Do you think it's going to require the creation of, let's say, a joint committee or some sort of agency that's run by the CFTC and this SEC? Do you think that they're each going to take a claim based on 100-year-old laws? How is it going to pan out?
It's super interesting, and you actually see this playing out across the globe, right? Dubai has the first ever crypto-only regulator in VARA, the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority. The UK, you're seeing different regulators sort of take different pieces of this. So it's going to be an interesting model. I think that the legislation that we've seen to date, at least, that presents sort of a more comprehensive framework, does not create a new supervisor, but rather sort of divides divide supervision amongst CFTC, SEC, the Fed potentially. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement. And again, it's less of a cop out than we don't know where this space is headed right now, and there hasn't been a ton of movement on Capitol Hill.
But there has been a consistent argument about how we regulate crypto in general. Is that, look, these rules were implemented in the 1930s when very few people even had telephones. I mean, it was kind of a mess, and it was a time that was very scammy, of course. And the information has changed, the way people view things has changed, and the nature of cryptocurrencies is sort of this new asset class that doesn't, at least a lot of people don't think that it neatly falls into either commodities or securities. So nonetheless, we have an SEC chairman who says, hey, these rules are just plenty fine for me to handle crypto, and I can pretty much regulate it because I could just beat everything into it. A lot of people in the industry don't believe so. Do you think Congress has the gumption? Do you think that it has the interest in even creating a new definition of what crypto is about? Or do you think that given everything that's happened, especially with these blowups like Luna and FTX, et cetera, that they're going to say, you know what, let Gensler handle this. We don't want to deal with this.
Look, I think the reality, and it's a great question, the reality is to date, the U.S. sort of regulatory or legal frameworks have come from enforcement actions and guidance from regulators as opposed to Capitol Hill. And we've certainly not seen a ton of movement, in terms of the legislative branch. That said, a really good example of this is this risk assessment, right? Essentially, it is the Treasury Department saying that from an anti-money laundering perspective, DeFi should be regulated by the Bank Secrecy Act, which has been essentially the way we've regulated traditional financial institutions that have compliance team, that have centralized controls, that file reports, right, that have policies and procedures. Well, if what we're talking about in a truly decentralized world is disintermediated software, right, the no teams of compliance professionals, I think that's a real challenge in terms of how do we apply sort of age-old regimes to crypto. And I think that this is a continued conversation that we keep having. And I do ultimately believe that we sort of have to modernize and have to get to a point where we have systems in place that really, really understand this technology and the value of this technology, right? For value transfer, for financial inclusion. And I think we'll see that play out, but there's no question that we are early days. I've said pre-first inning. It's possible we're still there.
I just wanted to very quickly talk a little bit about an opinion piece that Michael Casey, who is CoinDesk's chief content officer, he'd written a piece recently, and it was actually titled "Thanks Sam: How FTX Led to World's Worst Crypto Policy." And he was taking that entire conversation around regulation by enforcement to another level, where he was calling it regulation by retribution. I just wanted to understand what you think about those words, regulation by retribution.
Yeah, look, having spent 11 years at the Department of Justice and over 2 years at Treasury, from my experience, there's not a lot of sort of retribution happening. It's really more of, hey, we're taking these actions because we've decided as an institution, as a regulator, without guidance from Capitol Hill, that these actions are necessary. All of that said, I think it does go to this sort of larger problem, and that is, it is really hard into the traditional sort of financial system that we've had before. And I think we're going to ultimately see how this plays out. But the reality is regulators don't have guidance from Capitol Hill today. And I think that is probably a long time coming. But I think that's really what they're waiting for. And otherwise, they're going to continue to take these types of actions. If you look around the globe, there's a lot more clarity for businesses than exists today.
Well, thanks so much for that, Ari. I should mention out here that Michael's article, even though an opinion piece, it did have two sources, one named and one unnamed. The insights from those sources led to the architecture of that entire opinion piece. But thank you so much. That was TRM Labs Head of Legal and Government Affairs, Ari Redbord.